Welcome everyone who's joining to listen, and welcome Fiona. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. So this is the first of our In Conversation With in-house in focus sessions, and we're very pleased to kick it off with a discussion with Fiona Penhallurick. I've been tutored in how to say it properly Cornish. So we are going to talk for around about half an hour about the things that Fiona's been doing in her career and her experiences, and see where that conversation goes. What we've allowed for up to 45 minutes in case there are then questions from other people, and it may be I've got some questions that I'm planning to ask, but we'll see where the conversation goes. In terms of the structure, so we'll do the half an hour conversation, then we'll do the any questions that haven't been covered along the way, and then we'll finish. I think I've covered most of the formalities there. I've probably forgot something. Oh, and this is being recorded, so if you're watching the recording, you'll know that. If you're only able to join for part of the session, then you can always watch the rest later. Very good. So, Fiona, thanks for joining us. We picked you as our first In Conversation With guest on the basis that you've had an interesting and varied career. You've covered a number of different sectors. You were in the Lawyer Hot 100 last year, and we thought that there were quite a lot of topics that would be relevant to the in-house community on the call. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So in terms of kicking off, first I'll start with saying I'm hoping this is going to be more of a chat rather than an interrogation. It's a shame that I'm in a windowless cell-like room, but pretend I've got books or a fireplace next to me, not a kind of a windowless cell. So first question I was going to kick off with, in terms of your recent career, you were GC at Birmingham Airport. When you joined it, you probably didn't envisage there being a pandemic that was going to probably change the nature of that job. COVID lockdowns meant that it was a pretty tough time for aviation. You left the job 6 months ago. So looking back on how it went, how did you see it playing out?
Well, as you alluded to, not how it actually did. I mean, I joined to do a £500 million airport development and terminal expansion, and very quickly that wasn't going to happen. So airports are fascinating places in normal times, or so I'm told, but I never really worked there in normal times. They're like small towns. So from a legal perspective, they're fascinating. You have arrangements with shops and the police and parking and any number of different arrangements. But as you said, with somewhat comic timing, I'd been there 8 weeks when Flybe went insolvent the first time, and that was about a quarter of the traffic at Birmingham Airport. It had taken over from Monarch. And there 12 weeks when we had the formal lockdown, which changed everything.
So you probably just about finished induction when you were thrown into please deal with this mess.
Yeah, I hadn't quite done my 100 days when I was into reading the Airports Act and finding out how you put a lien on a plane.
Did you find yourself, I seem to remember we had a lot of discussion about force majeure around that time, and were you looking at contracts?
Definitely looking at contracts, although I alluded to it being a small town. Airports are amazing places and they're brilliant communities. So we particularly took the view at Birmingham that this was hopefully a short-term blip. And what was important to us was the long-term nature of our relationship. So we didn't necessarily hold our counterparties to the absolute letter of the contracts. We worked out what the practical consequences were going to be, not just for the the short term, but bearing in mind that we had long-term arrangements. So I didn't run an argument on, I didn't put forward an argument on any force majeure clause. Some people tried to sort of impose them on us, but on the whole, we had a much more collegiate discussion with our supply chain. And
Was that because that must have been as a newcomer to role, and making that judgment on the balance between the kind of pure legal analysis of the position and what the right commercial outcome, that was it difficult to, in terms of the discussions with the executive team, to get that balance right? Because I know that we found with our discussions with clients at the time that it wasn't always easy to know, when is it right to enforce those rights that we may have, and when is the bigger picture more important?
Yeah, I mean, not only was I new, half the exec team was new. So at the time we went into the pandemic, there was only one person on the exec team who had been in their role for more than 18 months. And most of us, or half of us, had been there less than 6 months. It forced us together, actually. It forced us to really sit around the table, and we thrashed some of this stuff out, and we got the principles about how we were going to do things sorted out quite quickly, and that was fundamentally important. And not that it was easy, but at least gave us we could have had a lot more friction in sorting that out if we hadn't done that. And as with all airports are used to dealing with things in terms of crises, so actually they kind of like a bit of a crisis, and they have the full-on gold command, silver command, bronze command structure that they apply to an aircraft fire, or we'll maybe talk about later when we had the Afghan refugees. There is a process in place which pulls people together, and everyone tends to drop their rank and just works together. So that was really important. I think we had a very clear direction from an early point that the CEO discussed with the board, and the board were very supportive of, about the approach that we were going to take to the contracts. And as you say, if we hadn't had that, it would have been monumentally difficult.
Well, that what you're discussing sort of links to one of the other topics I wanted to pick up on later, but perhaps it's a good time to talk about it. Because again, during the course of your career, you've mixed the legal and business roles. You've had roles such as Director of Corporate Affairs, Managing Director, Programme Manager, NED roles, but you've also come back to legal roles a number of times along the way. How do you get that mix right in your career? We'll come back to how you feel about the law perhaps in a bit, but also in terms of then that relationship with the CEO and the board, how do you get that? How do you position yourself, getting the right balance of the legal and the non-legal in your contribution?
I think it's incredibly challenging. It's probably the most challenging thing for in-house lawyers. And a lot of it depends on the view of the CEO and the board and the CFO. And if they really just think a lawyer should be in a very small box, there's probably not a lot you can do about it. And I guess as I've got older and more experienced, those are the questions that I ask at interview. And I don't, and I wouldn't take a role where their role of a lawyer was, can you, like mushroom-like, we'll keep you in the dark and throw stuff at you and until we choose to consult you. And there are definitely organisations that operate like that. And that's not where I want to be. That's not where I think lawyers can add the most value, obviously. So part of it's about choosing the right organisation, and part of it's about earning your stripes. There's nothing like bailing someone out of a difficult issue for them to realise that the benefit of the lawyer. But something I learned very early on, probably for my first role, I had an amazing boss in my first in-house role, and he was quite a tour de force. But he always offered up solutions rather than told people what to do. He did it quite forcefully and very articulately, and he was an incredibly bright guy. But I learned a lot from that. So I think, lawyers are used to, if you think you're right about everything, you're not. I can probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of times where the law has been absolutely clear and totally on point for the situation that you're in, and you're absolutely convinced that you know exactly what it is. You just have to offer it up and say, the law is, this is what the law says about it in this sort of scenario. And given these other factors, my advice is, however, I might not have all of the information. And actually, when I was an MD in an organisation, the hardest thing I had to do probably was when my then head of legal, who had been my team member a few weeks previously, came to me, and I'd asked her advice on something, and she'd given me the legal provision, and I said, thank you, I hear that, but I'm not going to do what you advise, because I've got other information that means that the risk balance that I'm dealing with means I'm going to take that legal risk, because I think there's a commercial risk over here which is greater.
And that must have been an interesting dynamic at the time, and I don't know how she responded to that. But did
she's an awesome. Well, she came to work for me. She worked for me in another organisation, so I think we probably did all right. But part of that was explaining it, and we've talked about it subsequently, and she said that was really helpful for her, because I think lawyers were used to being asked our opinion, and you sort of expect everyone to take it, don't you? Otherwise, why are you asking for it? But it's I think we need to understand, particularly as in-house lawyers, but private practice lawyers as well, it's part of the advice that's being taken, and it's not the whole picture. And you probably, the more of the picture you have, the better the advice you can give, but you're never going to have the same advice that the CEO or the FD or the other people have.
And presumably, from what you're describing, you didn't think that her she'd done her job properly and given.
Oh, she'd done her job brilliantly. Yeah, she's an awesome lawyer. I have huge respect for her. She's incredibly bright, very thorough, very meticulous, very commercial in what she said. She just didn't have the all of the pieces of the jigsaw, partly because it wasn't appropriate for me to share all of that at the time. This was in a situation where the company, so I was asked to step up to an MD role, and then within 3 weeks I was asked to close the European arm of this company. So the decision making shifted very substantially in a very short space of time.
So how did you move from the kind of pure legal into taking on those responsibilities for those other business decisions? Because, as you say, your head of legal in that context had done the right thing, made the recommendation from a legal point of view based on what she knew. How do you start showing the business that actually it's worth them including you on those other business issues, and then step into a broader role, whether it's as you say, managing director type role or more of a COO type role? How do you get that balance right without overstepping the mark in the first place, when actually you only know this much because that's your role? How do you how do you get that balance right?
Mm-hmm. I think you probably need to sort of sidestep. It's sort of a zigzag. You need to sidestep into a commercial role or a broader role. And then I think that's probably what I've done. I've sidestepped into a commercial role and then stepped up to a legal role with the benefit of that commercial experience, and then sidestepped again. So my second legal role in-house was with National Grid, and that had quite a large legal department and obviously a very large organisation. So the opportunity to do non-legal things was there, and I absolutely took that opportunity, and I perhaps wouldn't have had that in a smaller organisation. So my first non-legal role was as the commercial manager for the gas emergency service, which was fascinating. So sort of on point, it was really doing commercial contracts, which is sort of a core legal skill, but not just focusing just on the legal aspects of it. You needed to be able to understand the spreadsheet and the commercial implications of it. And when we were talking for this, what I was saying, one of my pet hates is lawyers who say, oh, I don't do numbers. That's like saying accountants saying I can't write sentences. It's just the business is run on numbers, whether you're a not-for-profit, whether you're regulated, whether you're unregulated, whether you're commercial. You have to understand the commercial consequences of that, and that's where I really cut my teeth on I had to present legal and commercial, and which included the finance side. And I had to say, how contracts were doing and where they were meeting against targets. And that was where I really learnt to understand a spreadsheet. I'm not brilliant, but that's part of the learning process, definitely.
And yet, despite taking on those business roles and including the, as you say, understanding the financial details are important to legal advice, you have come back from those business roles into legal roles. I've got a friend whose background was as a GC. He's taken on more business operational roles in recent years, but he's looking at options that include going back into GC type roles. I mean, what's brought you back to legal roles? Do you find the law interesting now? Has that changed over your career?
I don't think I've ever found the law itself interesting. I think that goes back to university. I enjoyed the really useless stuff like piracy on the high seas, but I can't say I ever found contract law or anything like that particularly interesting when I was at university. I love using the way that my legal brain has been trained to solve problems. And I think probably as I've got more senior, it's more the company secretary part of it so that gives you a seat at the table. In most organizations, the CEO and CFO sit on the board. Increasingly, the company secretary does. So I sat on the board in my role as company secretary rather than as GC, and statistically, most CEOs are male, most CFOs are male. A large number of in-house lawyers are female. So if you want to have a female on the board, you're most likely to get there as a company secretary. And so that's, I think it gives you that ability to have a seat at the table. Then you know what's going on, and then you can give properly contextualized advice and just be part of the discussion. So I don't think I've ever sort of formally planned my career in any shape or form. I've sort of critically analysed the opportunities which have come to me at any particular point in time and decided whether I do or don't want to go with them.
Well, and that neatly takes me to the next question I wanted to ask, actually, was in terms of the planning of your career, because you've been in sectors including energy, recycling, construction, aviation. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about sustainability in a moment, which I know is sort of a current theme of where you're focusing. But taking a step back, I mean, you say you've kind of analysed the facts at the time and made the decisions about career based on just what the opportunities were. Actually, as an outsider, it looks quite neat. They all tie together. But I think what you're saying is it wasn't necessarily a neatly planned career. How do you look back at it now?
Well, I think it sort of probably all came from the first step. So my first in-house role, I was 18 months qualified. It looked incredibly sexy and interesting, and it was. So I went to work for GC, for their telecoms division. I turned up on my first day. I'm that old that there was a fax on my desk. My boss was in Hong Kong, and he'd left me a fax going, sort out these 4 multi-million-pound international contracts. I'll see you on Tuesday next week. So that I absolutely landed on my feet there. He was an amazing boss. I got to do contracts in China, in Taiwan, in Australia, in Russia. It was an amazing place to cut my teeth. But I got malaria while I was traveling. And there was 1 year I was away a quarter of the year, which was not really sustainable, certainly not if you want to think about having a family at any point in time. And I was approached about the job at what was then Transco, National Grid. And I kept being asked about it by a recruitment consultant. And I think it was about 9 months before I finally conceded and said, okay, I'll come and have an interview with you, because gas sounded really boring after international telecoms contracts. But actually it was fascinating. And so that sort of, having gone in there and the opportunities which a massive organisation like National Grid gave me, and I took a role as the executive assistant to the CEO Steve Holliday, who was the CEO at the time, which was absolutely fascinating. Amazing opportunities. And then I sort of found myself, I sort of thought, well, I better have a narrative here about what my career is. It's not retail. You would go to recruitment consultants, headhunters, and they say, well, what's your specialism? And although to some extent you don't need a specialism in-house, you can apply it. You obviously bring extra benefits if you can bring that sort of wealth of knowledge and experience. So I sort of decided at that point that sort of broadly I would do infrastructure, and that's been my sort of swim lane, I suppose, since then.
And it's interesting you used the word narrative as in that you had a narrative. I mean, we've been going through internal promotion processes in terms of our next generation of partners coming through at Milton Reeve, and I've been involved in discussions around business cases and so on. And it's interesting that that narrative, the explaining who you are and how you fit in, it sounds like that's whether you're in-house, whether you're in private practice, or whether they're the right labels now. That seems to be still very important to sell yourself and develop a career.
I think that's definitely right. You're absolutely right with, if you 149 characters or whatever. I was talking to my my daughter and her boyfriend at the weekend and saying, you've got to have your elevator pitch. You've got to be, and over time there's not, the more you have to say, the more refined you have to be. But I do think you need to be able to get over to people in 3 or 4 sentences what you are and what you want to do. And actually I've been remarkably blessed with the kindness of strangers. People do actually want to help you. People are interested, although I firmly believe, someone told me much earlier in my career, the only person who's genuinely interested in your career is you, which I think is true, and you have to take responsibility for it. But other people along the way will help you, and they will mentor you, and they will be interested, and but you've got to give them the right information for them to be able to do that. So having that narrative, that elevator pitch, however you want to term it, I think is really important.
And how do you? Again, I'm going to use in-house because you've used it, so I'm going to work on the assumption that we're still comfortable with the phrase in-house. I'm conscious from talking to some of our clients in-house roles that they're very busy. They've got their head down doing the desk load of work, and perhaps they may have their small team of lawyers that they're working with day to day. They may have the external lawyers that they're working with. But how do you then find that? How do you find access to that broader mentor group? I think it's one of the luxuries sometimes of being in a law firm is, there are, well, it depends on the law firm, but a firm like Milton Reeve, you've got hundreds of people that are just there with very similar careers to you, whereas in-house, you may be in a team of, maybe just you, maybe 5 or 10 lawyers. How do you find that network of potential mentors?
Yeah, I mean, so starting at the end, actually, I would never have taken the role at Birmingham Airport because I went in as sole legal counsel initially, and the idea was to build a team, but obviously with COVID that didn't happen. And I could never have done that role without my network, my phone of friends, both in private practice and fellow colleagues. So part of it is people I've worked with. One of my phone of friends was someone who I recruited into National Grid 25 years ago. And you stay in contact. There's a Midlands in-house network that actually that guy set up and chairs. There's some great organisations, LBC Wise Counsel. If anyone doesn't know anyone who's in-house doesn't know Paul Gilbert and hasn't been on a LB Cambridge course, thoroughly recommend it. And they do an LB Cambridge course for junior in-house lawyers, which is staffed by GCs and heads of legal. You do it for a nice weekend in Cambridge and a bottle of wine. It's not paid, but I've mentored people that have come off that, and my network of other GCs from that. I've met people on that who've become firm friends and mentors as part of that, and so just it is worth it. COVID was really difficult for that, but firms like Mills Reeve and other firms do some great training sessions. but actually what's almost as important as the training session is turning up to them and being introduced to people and meeting other in-house counsel. And the other thing, you mentioned sustainability, and I've joined Lawyers for Net Zero, which is currently focused on in-house lawyers, but I did a couple of their sort of I can't remember what Adam will kill me, I can't remember what it's actually called, but there's the sort of, you have a group of about 4 of you, work groups, and you sort of set your own targets for what you're going to do, and you hold each other accountable for it, and it's over a sort of 3-month period. And again, that's another network of people with a very specific objective, and all working together and holding each other accountable, but also providing support to each other.
That sounds, yeah, I mean, that sounds a little bit, we have a partner development program that involves small groups coming together and exactly as you described, sort of setting their own agenda, but I think that's been very successful for us. Well, and we'll come back to sustainability in a moment, but on that point, I mean, I suppose as you know, you and I both trained at you trained at Pensons, I trained at what was Masons. I've spent my entire career in private practice. I've only moved firms once when I moved here when I was at MQ. You've been mostly in-house. How different do you think those careers are now, and how different do you think our careers have been? And am I missing out by not doing what you've done? And do you have any regrets about not spending more time in private practice?
I think private practice, even in the 10 years between us, changed very significantly. There's a saying that you can't be one if you can't see one. And certainly when I was a trainee, I think Pensons had 1 or maybe 2 female partners. Right. And with the best will in the world, I didn't aspire to be like either of those. It wasn't clear to me how I could ever possibly have a family and do that, or certainly not have a family and see my children. So I decided fairly early on that if I didn't want to be a partner, because that wasn't a goal I particularly aspired to and didn't fit in with everything else I wanted to do with my life, there wasn't an awful lot of point of being a beasted junior in-house lawyer, which was again very much how it was all those years ago. So there are pluses and minuses of both. I love being part of the business. I love rolling my sleeves up and getting involved in loads of things. I've learned all sorts of useless pieces of information about recycling and how the gas network works, and about the Thames Tideway Tunnel and all sorts of interesting things. The disadvantage of being in-house is that you do have to move generally, unless you go into a very, very big legal department, the likes of Shell, or possibly some of the larger organisations. You do have to move because it becomes dead man's shoes. And that can be quite, and out inside London, that's much easier. There's a lot more in-house jobs in London, but if you're outside London, that does restrict your career path unless you want to be moving, and that obviously depends on your partner and your children and other considerations. So I'm really glad I did what I did. It hasn't been a straightforward ride. I've been made redundant 4 times, one of them voluntarily, 3 of them less so. But I'm really glad that I did, because each time that I did, it's horrible at the time, and has all of the negative connotations you'd expect, but you brush yourself off and you pick yourself up, and each time I have gone on something way more interesting, really exciting, probably something I wouldn't have thought of had I not had that push. And people have just been amazing. I mean, one of my favourite roles that I had was the chair of the independent compensation panel for Thames Tideway. And that came to me. I was chatting to a friend at the end of a park run, and he introduced me to one of his friends who was a director at Thames Tideway, and they said, "Oh, we've got a role coming up, you'd be great for that." So quasi job interview in Lycra, don't recommend it. Yeah, I didn't even know that role existed, and I wouldn't have had that opportunity had I not been in the situation that I was at. So definitely not a planned career. I suspect yours has a much more clearer trajectory than mine, but no less exciting for that.
well, and as you say, more opportunities, more variety. I think you're at my regrets. Anyway, so I did want to talk about sustainability, and I think when you and I were talking in preparation for this, I was saying that ESG is a really big theme for us. We're seeing it on almost every tender we submit, that our clients want to know what we're doing. Our people, when we recruit them, I've been grilled by potential recruits. What are we doing? And so I mean, what are you doing at the moment? So in terms of, you know, what's in sustainability is keeping you busy, but also how much of this is a kind of trendy thing of now, and how much of this is something that we're going to be all focusing on for the future?
Okay, well, I was probably answering the last question first. This is absolutely vital for the future, and the time is now. The time is now for everyone, and the time is now for law firms specifically, and for lawyers in general, because everybody else recognises that. And if you don't jump on it now and get yourself educated and prepared, you're going to be behind the curve. And you know, the accountancy and general consultancy firms are already all over it, and I suspect a number of the law firms are slightly behind the curve. Do more than pay lip service to it for some of the reasons you've alluded to. Your clients want you to, your employees want you to, and it's frankly the right thing to do, and not just to be able to tick the right box on a tender, but because it's the right thing to do. So, you know, at the most basic, you should be able to understand what your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are. You should be working out how you're going to work out what your scope 3 emissions are. And certainly in the work that I was doing at the airport, you know, that was something we were working out. And there's a long lead time on some of that stuff. If you're going out to tender for something for a particular contract which might last sort of 4 or 5 years, you have to get the wording right, and there's a lot to help you with that. Things like the Chancery Lane project, Lawyers for Net Zero. There's some precedents out there that you can start introducing, and I think that's really important. Excuse me one moment, I just have a small feline to be removed. So I had a big soul search about whether I would join the airport at all, because it's fairly or unfairly the poster child for how not to do net zero. I spoke to a number of friends and colleagues who are much more involved in that area than I am, and they sort of said, well, if that job should be taken by someone who is passionate about it and who does care about it and will make a difference. So I did, but tried to get myself as educated as possible. And since I left the airport, I've done 2 courses. I did the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership course on business and net zero, and then the more specific course that Oxford does online for lawyers and sustainability. Just increasing my knowledge and seeing how I can do things. But I think it's fundamentally important, and I don't think it's a fad. I think, you know, it's so important. It's sort of the next most important thing now for corporate social responsibility. Greenwashing is becoming an enormous issue for companies, and it's really important for supply chain. You know, to look at what your contracts are like. It's sort of in the same way maybe a few years ago you were looking at modern slavery and anti-bribery and corruption. It's the next thing to really have a look at your procurement process and your contracts and really get involved and sort it out.
So I think what you've said about not just paying lip service is, I think, a thing that we're very conscious of, that while we are being put to task on explaining our credentials, actually people see through that pretty quickly if you're just if you're just doing it for show. But I think we've grappled with as a law firm is of ESG, other than emissions that everyone can comment on, there's a temptation to just focus on the S bit and less on the others, and think, well, we're just a law firm. How, what can we do on the other things? And I guess in a way that's totally different to, say, working in an airport, in terms of the best opportunities to do the right thing. So yeah, the things you're saying are very helpful and ring true in terms of the areas that we could be focusing on, and the conversations to be in, and the people to be talking to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your perspective. At an airport, actually, the airport actually only runs the building and the runway, so the majority of the emissions come from the flights. So in terms of the infrastructure, yes, making sure that you've got the ability to put in sustainable aviation fuel facilities on the airport is an airport responsibility, but they're never going to run the fuel farm themselves. They don't run the current fuel farms. They're not going to run that. So it is that supply chain, that interaction, that understanding the sort of the whole ecosystem, if you like, and understanding your role and being flexible, and being prepared to be innovative when people come to you with ideas.
So I'm going to link. There was a question that's come in from one of the people that have joined us to a question I was going to ask, which was I'll link their comment about the fact that you've obviously had a wonderful career so far, and the question was, what did you learn from your role at Birmingham Airport, and why did you decide to move on? And I'm going to link that to the question I was going to ask, which is, what do the next 5 years look like, and how does one thing lead to the next?
It has been really exciting. What did I learn from Birmingham? So much. I mean, it was just the most extraordinary time. And I did things both from a legal perspective, but from a personal perspective, that I would never expect to do. We kept very quiet about it because we thought the important thing was to do it, not shout about it. But Birmingham processed 2/3 of the Afghan refugees. So for about 10 days, I did my day job for about 3 hours in the morning. And then I handed out food and clothes and nappies and to refugees. That was amazing. Got in contact with other suppliers. So I think give everything a go. Be humble. Be kind. Actually, it was a really, really, one of the things I learned very early on at the airport. One of our IT engineers, he had a lot of family in Manchester, and I think by about, I don't know, week 12 of the pandemic, he had lost multiple family members and had various other family members hospitalised. I only got COVID 3 weeks ago for the first time. Our situations were so completely different. So I just learned that it's really important to treat everyone with kindness and fairness, and you never know anyone else's story. So just take that into whatever scenario you're at. Be flexible, be positive, and just give everything a go, because it's you never know where it might end up. Why did I leave? I was made redundant. So I said I went in to do a multi-million-pound airport expansion. We didn't do that. We spent the money that we should have wanted to spend on that, keeping afloat for 3 years. So that was my skill set. I've done infrastructure projects. There wasn't a large infrastructure project for me to do. So we decided to part company. And what am I doing now? I'm doing I'm at that stage, which is lovely, where I don't really feel that I'm working, because everything I'm doing I just love doing, and I'm doing stuff because it interests me and because it's fun. And so I'm doing quite a lot of work with SMEs, so small companies that don't have their own in-house legal department, and they'll just come to me and say they've got a particular transaction, or can I have a look at their terms and conditions because I haven't looked at them for 10 years, or could I just give them some advice on something particular. I've done quite a lot of pro bono work, so from a Ugandan health centre to a company that does careers advice for kids in schools. So a whole mixture of stuff. And then I've taken the opportunity to, as I said, to do a couple of courses to increase my knowledge on sustainability. And in fact, I'm now going back and I'm assessing on one of the courses that I did last year. So I'm assessing on the Cambridge course starting in a couple of weeks' time.
You've been pretty busy. I think I've probably got time for a couple more questions. So I've got another question I want to pick up that's come through from one of our guests, joiners, whatever you call the people that are listening. So saying, amazing to be able to listen to the span of your expertise. Ask the question, what requalified lawyers from other jurisdictions can bring to the table? I don't know whether you've worked with lawyers from other jurisdictions during the course of your career, and also the question about languages, and how important languages are in the UK legal business context.
So I haven't worked directly with too many people from other jurisdictions necessarily. Oh, that's not true. Most in-house roles, they quite often ask for a practicing certificate, but you don't really need one as long as you've got sort of legal skills. I think if you haven't worked in a common law, if your home legal system is very different, then I think that would be, France, for example, has a very, very different legal system to the UK. So that might be more problematic than someone who perhaps comes from an African country or from Australia, where they have a more similar legal system just because of the way that we do things. But in-house law, I'd never read the Gas Act until I went to National Grid, and I'd never read the Airports Act until I went to the airport. So if you're intelligent and articulate, you're equally as capable, probably more capable than I am, of reading that and discerning the information. We had 2 interns when I was at the airport, and I was determined that they would be from either people from other jurisdictions or from people who didn't have a background in law. So I didn't want anyone, forgive me, who mummy and daddy could ask their mates to get them an internship. I wanted someone where we were really making a difference. And we had a guy who was studying at UCB, but was from Nigeria. And he just looked at things completely differently. And actually the other intern we had spoke Welsh as her first language. So, fascinating to have that perspective. And certainly when I worked internationally earlier in my career, it was always fascinating seeing how the German lawyers or the German people came at it differently to the Chinese, to the different cultures, and just being able to tailor your advice and how you went about things in a culturally sensitive way. So I think the more people you have in any situation, the better you are going to be. You're always going to be better than some of the parts.
I totally agree with everything you've said from a private practice and my team point of view as well. I think diversity in the team makes the team stronger, and those other experiences are really important. I think we're out. We've got a couple more questions coming through, but I think we're probably out of time to go through them. So I think I just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing so much with everyone who's joining. If anyone wanted to raise any more questions, obviously we'll see if there's a way of picking them up somehow offline or in a future session. And I hope anyone I hope there are some non-lawyers on who heard you say how important it is to be kind. It'd be great to hear some non-lawyers hear that lawyers think it's important to be kind. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and good luck with that range of things that are coming next.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Peter.